I wasn't ready for that to start. Well, let's go with it. Why not? All right, Mr. Sapora here, and this week in marine biology, we're going to be learning about marine vertebrates, phylum Chordata, Vertebrata. Okay, strap in. This is kind of a longer series of notes that we got to do, but there's some really cool information in here, and hopefully you'll have a bunch of like, oh yeah, I get it, kind of moments. All right, let's go. So, Chordata, Vertebrata. What am I talking about here? What am I referring to? When we talk about phylum, we're talking about the group right below animal kingdom. So we're talking about animals. So we're talking about a certain group of animals. What do they share in common? Well, you might have already guessed it. It is a backbone, a cord, spinal cord, or vertebrae. These little bones that make up our spinal cord. Or that our spinal cord runs through, basically. Not all members of Chordata have vertebrae, actually. One group, the Agnathans, which we're going to talk about later, just have a cord without the actual bone surrounding it, but the rest have the sort of vertebral column that surrounds that spinal cord. So when we look at groups of animals in the animal kingdom, we go underneath animal and then we get to phylum. And we can start with the most primitive phylums and we can work our way to over here to the most advanced phylum, most recently evolved, and a lot of variety within that as well. But let's back up here. So this is an activity I do in biology class. I get everybody to close their eyes, and I want you to lock in the first thing that comes to your mind when I say it, this next word. Lock it in. Don't hem and haw, don't make up your mind. First thing that comes to mind, lock it. So I'm going to say the word. You're going to boop. Keep that thing in there. Okay, ready? And the word is animal. I said animal. What was the first thing that popped into your head? We can't talk to each other, this is YouTube. But most people, when I do this activity, and I'll go around the room and write them all down on a whiteboard, will say things like tiger, or dog, or maybe even fish, or a whale. Giraffe, zebra, horse, Tillamook, cow. What do all of those things have in common? Usually only one student varies from that group that I just gave you. And the thing that everybody is naming are animals that have a backbone. But that's only one small group, actually, as we're going to find out today, of animals. There's a huge variety in the animal kingdom. And there's 9 basic phylums that things have been divided into. Now they're splitting them into more groups, getting more nuanced, but we'll go old school and say 9. And each of those 9 phylums, they all share things in common. They're groupings. And everybody tends to think that all animals, or in their own head, animals, have backbones. We'll talk about that in just a second. So let's look at the different groups of animals before we get to the vertebrates. We're doing this in our weekly species list because actually most things in the ocean don't have a backbone. Right? The ocean holds the big variety of life, and as you can see, only 1 out of 9 has a backbone, right? So most animals do not have a backbone, as we will find out here. First group of animals, way over here on the left, the porifera, the sponges, are the oldest, right? They're over 650 million years old, around 850, I believe, and they're really simple animals. They're multicellular, but each cell kind of works on its own. There's no circulatory system. There's no nervous system. Obviously, there's no head or face or eyes or mouth. Right, those are all things that we think that animals have because we have them, but as we find out, that's not always true. These guys are just big filters that sit in the water, and as currents go through them, they collect plankton, and then they digest it, so they're a consumer heterotroph. And they're some of the oldest animals on the planet, multicellular eukaryotes. The next group up would be cnidarians, and we've studied those, right? Let's see if we can zoom this in. Cnidarians are your jellyfish, your corals, your anemones, and they're simple, radial symmetry, simple nervous system, no circulatory system, no head, no eyes, nothing like that, and just a few tissue layers. They poop and eat out of the same hole. Sucks to be you. The next group over, from the cnidarians in animal evolution and animal phylums, we have not 1, not 2, but 3 different phylums out of the 9 belong to just different types of worms. There are many different forms of worms. We have looked at a few of them. We looked at flatworms right here. Simple, flat. And then, of course, we looked at the Glycera americana, the American bloodworm. This is a larger member of that group, and these are segmented worms. These actually have a circulatory system. They have a mouth and a full digestive system, so they poop out of a butt. Ain't that right? Okay, so we've already ran through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 phylums out of the 9 of animals, all really simple. None of them have backbones, right? Really basic. Then we can jump over, and now we're going to start to get more complicated, right? Now we get things like the echinoderms. Now, how much more complicated? Well, they don't have a brain, they don't have a head necessarily, but they do have a radial nerve system. They have a basic water vascular circulatory system, right? They have those hydraulic feet that they can move with. They have little light sensors, eye spots on the ends of some of their digits. Do I have any more echinoderms here? I have a few. Ooh, look at that. There we go. So the sea stars, of course, Dendraster here, right? Sand dollars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, all of those types of things. One whole phylum of animals there. Jump over into another phylum of animals. Again, none of these have backbones yet. The largest phylum on the planet, Arthropoda. And Arthropoda consists of a whole range of different things, right? So first off, it is the insects, right? Including scorpions and spiders, and insect is one of those groups, I guess. Crustaceans are in Arthropoda. So we've got your shrimps, yeah, and crabs. And where's some more of our arthropods around here? Ooh, here's a mole crab. We have these here. Find these washed up in the beach all the time. Huge, huge group on land and in the ocean as well. Well represented out there. And then, yeah, I think I showed you these, right? Flying insects as well on land. Pretty cool stuff. Arthropods actually account for, drumroll please, a shocking 80% of all animals are arthropods. Lock that in. Out of all these groups that you see here, 80% are in just this one group, Arthropoda, here on planet Earth. So, when I said animal, you probably thought of something with the vertebrate. You should have thought of an arthropod, some type of insect or a crustacean there. The next group up, before we get to ourselves, is another huge group, and it is this one here, mollusca, the mollusks, right? So clams and snails and slugs, and there's lots of these in the ocean. And as well as cephalopods, which are really cool. Octopus and squid. There we go. There's a cephalopod. And we'll talk about that group in our species list. I cover these phylums in the species list because they are the most representative. There's more of them than anything else. When I think of ocean, everybody wants to think about fish, but actually it's all the other things that make up the majority of things in the ocean. And in fact, I'm going to hammer that point right now. I've covered all of the different phyla that we've seen here already. I've just talked about all of these. The 3 different groups of worms, the cnidarians, the sponges, the mollusks, the arthropods, and the echinoderms. When I said animal, you probably thought vertebrate. Now, maybe in this class, you didn't. So I'm drawing something here. That's even too much. When I said animal, you said vertebrate. Vertebrates, as you can see at the bottom of our screen here, this was a pie chart, make up about that much, probably less, of all the animal kingdom. Everything in white that you see in this circle is everything else we've just talked about. Vertebrates make up 4% total of the animal kingdom. Just 4%. So 96% of all animals do not have a backbone. They're everything I just showed you. And only a small percentage actually have a backbone. Sharks and fishes, which we're going to talk about sharks today, we'll talk about fish next week, are the first, or some of the earlier members. And then we move into more familiar groups of vertebrates, amphibians, and then, of course, reptiles. Here's a cool one looking at a turtle. You can see its vertebrae are welded into the shell itself, but it has the vertebrae. And then, finally, birds, which we've already covered, and mammals, like me, and like my buddy over here, Leo, who's going to be Joe Exotic for Halloween. So these are animals with backbones. And again, only 4% of the animal kingdom. And that's a fake skeleton. That's not real, in case you're totally freaked out right now. And it's October when I'm filming this. It's almost Halloween. Okay, there we go. Chordate animals, just 4%. When you look at the geologic timescale, if you want to go through this from an evolutionary perspective, we're not going to go too much into that right now. But each of these groups appears in a chronological fashion, starting with the simplest, the sponges in the oceans, right, over 800 million years ago. And then we start to see the cnidarians, and then we start to see the different worms, groups of worms. And then I believe shortly after that, we have a larger radiation. We start to see mollusks and echinoderms and arthropods and all these other things. These guys ruled the ocean for a long time. And vertebrates really come about, well, let's get into it here in marine vertebrates. So vertebrates share these things in common with each other then, the phylum Vertebrata. And, okay, so they have a vertebral column. What makes a vertebrate a vertebrate? They have a vertebral column. Vertebrates have specialized sensory organs. They have a brain consisting of concentrated nerves at the anterior end of the nerve cord. So one of the things that all vertebrates share in common is this cluster of nerves at the anterior, meaning at the front end. Posterior is the bottom end of the vertebral column. And that is where they process information. And then there's a cluster of nerves that run down this vertebral column cord to these different muscle blocks that they have. So they also have segmented muscle blocks, muscles in different groups. And they are wired in with nerves, and those nerves then are all kind of run by the brain system, which communicates to the muscles and tells them to react in different ways, so that not all your muscles react in the exact way at the exact same time. So what allows us to run and jump and climb and pitch a ball or swim side to side or dive down and then turn, etc. Vertebrates also respire, meaning they breathe, through gills or lungs. So they have specialized organs that take oxygen out of the water or out of the air and move it then into the next part, probably, bing, a circulatory system that will then carry that oxygen and nutrients, because it's hooked up to the digestive system as well. The circulatory system's plugged into both. It'll move those nutrients and gases, which could be a nutrient, I guess, around to the muscle blocks, and then oxygenate them and carry waste away, carbon dioxide, and then expel it through the gills or through the lungs as well. And that circulatory system in all vertebrates is made up of a heart that has chambers, arteries, veins, and then capillaries. Or arteries go to the capillaries, and then the veins carry the polluted blood away. Cool thing about the brain, too, when you look at this evolutionarily, so hopefully from biology you have kind of an understanding of how evolution works, right? It works on pre-existing features through natural selection, and as variations in the population arise, certain variations are favorable, and those can get selected for, right, by others being selected against. So certain traits are not beneficial. That particular organism in that population with those traits will get taken out, and then the organisms with the favorable traits will survive and reproduce and pass on those traits, and those traits will become the major traits of the population throughout time. So a new thing doesn't just arise from magic, it's variations on things that are already there. So when you look at our brains, all vertebrates have a similar brain structure, and you can see it advance through the different groups, right? First, you've got the agnathans and the fishes and sharks, which we'll talk about. So here you've got a perch brain, which is a fish brain, and it's got all the different parts of the brain that we do, the medulla oblongata, the midbrain, the forebrain, these olfactory bulbs, and all these other parts. But they're all in separate spheres. They're all in separate little nerve cluster groups. And then throughout time, amphibians would be the next group up. These would be, they still have gills, they have many traits like a fish. They're kind of half fish, half reptile, and that's why they're called amphi, meaning both, and then on land being. So they're both a fish and a reptile. That's what the name actually means. And they have traits of each, and their brain still has the lobing, but you could see the fusing right here of those brain lobes into instead of into separate blocks, now they're all clustered together and can communicate more efficiently with each other. But it's a variation on a theme that was already there. Then in reptile brains, you see that fusing continue and then start to wrap around. And then in birds, you see it even continue further in here. And then finally in mammal brains, you see everything's not only fusing, right? And the forebrain becoming much more produced, which is what makes us better thinkers, but also that then texturing of it to give the brain more surface area as well. That's a little bit of an aside, but it's cool stuff to think about, right? See the connections in all these groups, because there are connections. And evolution makes sense of those connections. Back to where we are here. The other thing that vertebrates have is blood that contains hemoglobin, which is a protein in red blood cells, and that is only in vertebrates. Birds have a variation on that. Seabirds, the myoglobin protein, but it's in the hemoglobin family. So again, connections, right? This is a structure, a protein structure that you see in all vertebrates that also goes through our circulatory system. So, you know, I mean, I know that I look nothing like a fish, kinda, but yet we have all of these things in common. Right, we have the vertebral column, we have these sensory organs, noses, eyes, things that can detect sound, etc. Fishes have lateral lines that can sense things in their environment. We have, you know, other sensory organs, touch and things like that, but it's very similar because we're on land. We have a brain that's very similar in the perch brain and the mammal brain and all of its parts, although you can see that ours is more advanced, but you could watch it advance looking at the different groups. We have muscles broken into different blocks. They respire through gills, we respire through lungs, but those are all connected to our circulatory system, which is the same in all of us, and our heart and how all that's plumbed together is the same. And we share proteins and many, many other things. We can go down the line there and spend all day on it. You're probably thinking, Sapora, you are spending all day on it. Okay, and there are 7 classes of vertebrates that currently exist, and I just kind of ran through those. But we have the jawless fishes. Fishes? Do they get stitches? Okay. Which we'll talk about the agnathans, the lampreys, and then we get the sharks, and then we get the fish. So 3 of the 7 are in water, and 4 of the remaining 7 vertebrates are in land. So amphibians are both. Amphibians are that literally that, you know, it's not missing, but that link between, you know, fish and the rest of us terrestrial animals. They have gills, they have soft eggs, they have tails when they're born, and then they develop legs. And then reptiles, birds, and then mammals. Okay. Let's talk about the agnathans and then the sharks. So let's go. So the first group of chordates or vertebrates are the agnathans and their jawless fishes. This is an interesting group, and we'll kind of run through it quickly. They consist of hagfish and lampreys. And some traits about them, they lack paired fins or biting jaws. Cool beans. Meaning they don't have pectoral fins, they only use their tails to swim, and they don't have a jaw structure. They have this more circular, raspy mouth that they attach to things and suck their blood or burrow through them. And instead of a true vertebrate, like bones that we see connecting here, that you could pull out, right, they have just this notochord, so hard at this camera, which is the cartilaginous cord that runs through the spinal column that carries all the nerves. We have that too. We have a notochord, but that's all they have. And then their nerves kind of are zip tied to it to secure it, but it's not as fully protected as it would be in other vertebrates by this nice bony structure that really protects the spinal cord from spinal damage, right? If you had a notochord and no spinal cord, you could never sustain a hit on the back without being crippled. But these guys living in the water and stuff don't take a lot of impact, and they avoid that. Notochord, again, is found in all vertebrate embryos. It's part of our development, and then what ends up encasing it are the bones in us as we develop. And the oldest fossils for these are 540 million years old. Again, animals themselves around 850 for some of the sponges, and many of these other groups about 300 million years. We see what we call the animal radiation. Once you get multicellular, evolution has a lot to work with, and we see these different groups arising throughout the fossil record. And then we see the earliest evidence of vertebrates even back that, 540 million years ago there. And here's what their mouths look like. This is a lamprey's mouth. It's circular and raspy. And then this is a hagfish mouth up here, and similar style and almost like a jaw there, right? Almost like a jaw, but there's no bones in this. This is just muscle structure that allows them to kind of rasp, and hagfish specialize in chewing through dead things, so they will find especially dead whales or sharks at the bottom of the ocean, and then they'll kind of burrow through them. They're really gross. I mean, they're cool, but they're gross. Hagfish also produce this amazing slimy ooze that they secrete out, and it's just this mucusy. It's a defense mechanism. No one wants to eat that or get that in their mouth. No one. And it also allows them to move through a carcass nice and smoothly. It's gross. Lampreys, one of the weekly questions we'll have you focusing on them, are delicious. They're actually a really good and nutritious food source. Native Americans fish them quite often, and yeah, they're delicious. You can get. I was trying to think of the name at Japanese restaurants. It is, I believe it's uni or unagi. I can't remember which one. Anyway, you can order eel. It's cooked, and it's really high in calorie. It's really oily, but very, very delicious. And they come up our rivers here, too. We often don't see them. They stay near the bottom, and they migrate like salmon. They are actually anadromous. They spend their adult life in the ocean, and they come back up here, burrow in the gravel, and lay their eggs in the gravel. And in 7th grade, if you guys did Salmon Watch, you might have seen some in some of the stream sampling that we did here with the microscopes. I know in the groups that I've led, it's one of the things I look for down in the gravel, and we often find really tiny little baby lamprey. They grow up literally staying in the gravel, moving around and feeding, and then they head out to the ocean when they become adults and then come back, migrate in. They often will attach themselves to salmon. Kind of cool. One of the oldest vertebrates on the planet. So if you're ever out salmon fishing or in the rivers and you see one of these, just think about this. And they don't even have gills, right? They have these little holes, gill slits or openings, but not like we think of with gills, where they take in water and a real primitive sort of eye spot. The most ancient type of vertebrate out there on the planet. Pretty cool stuff there. Oh, I'm going to back it up. We're going to take a break here. Hang on. Boom. I'm back. I had to switch something up here, and Sapora, as I refer to myself in the third person, is going to pull an audible. Instead of jumping to sharks this week, we're going to finish up with talking about nectin, because sharks are really where we start to get into that. So it's a good transition. So we've talked about plankton, and now we're going to jump into again and talk about nectin. Much of what we've talked about so far in this unit, and I'm going to back it up and just do a little art here for you. Much of what we've talked about in all the phylums of animals, if you really stop and think about this, has been not nectin and not even plankton. So what type of ocean organism is it that we have been talking about so far? It's not nectin, it's not plankton. And so far, what we've talked about are things that are benthic. Benthic. They're on the bottom. They're not swimming up in the water. And if you think about animal life, like we've talked about, 90% of all marine organisms are benthic organisms. That benthic neritic, that near the shore, right? Here's the shoreline right here, the littoral zone. And then you head out along the coastline until you're at about 200 meters or 600 feet deep. And then you drop off that continental slope where all life exists. And so most marine organisms are benthic. They're down in the bottom here. Look at this picture right here. Everything's on the bottom, just one fish up here. And if you look at everything that I've talked about so far, sponges attached to the bottom of the ocean. Now, with the exception of jellyfish, anemones and corals are on the bottom of the ocean. We're going to talk about 3 different phylums of worms. Bottom of the ocean, in the mud, in the sediment itself, right? Very few worms. Flatworms can free swim, but they kind of free swim to and from a specific location and very short distances. Echinoderms, sand dollars, sea cucumbers, sea stars, sea urchins, all benthic organisms attaching to the bottom. When we think about the mollusks, clams, mussels, right? benthic, except for the cephalopods, which then go free swimming, like things like that. But octopus, where are they hunting and feeding? Almost always on the bottom, right? They can just get up and move around. So they're sort of a benthic organism, really. When you think about it, they burrow. They live under crevices. And then you get into the arthropods. You've got crabs and crustaceans, benthic, 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 benthic. Now the shrimp and the copepods evolved and learned to take advantage of the phytoplankton, so they became zooplankton. And now we're talking about plankton, though, not nectin yet. Where do we get nectin? What is nectin? We talked about this at the beginning. Nectin are composed mainly of your vertebrate groups. We're going to talk about osteichthyes and chondrichthyes coming up. Osteichthyes are bony fish. Chondrichthyes are cartilaginous fish, sharks and rays. And then we've got lesser amounts, right? So the majority of the nectin in the ocean is fish and sharks. Fish and sharks. And this doesn't come about until vertebrates evolve, right? And the first vertebrates are chordates, would be the lampreys and the agnathans 540 million years ago. But even those guys are started scavenging along the bottom, right? They're not up in the water column free swimming around. But then with the sharks, you get fish that actually swim around and hunt. Now, sharks are benthic feeders. They hunt on the bottom, as we'll learn about next week, and that's why their mouths are always down at the bottom. In fact, a shark mouth, maybe you can see it here. I've got a shark in a jar. Its mouth is down here at the bottom, not on the end of its face. Fish mouths tend to move out towards the end of the face more as more things appear in the water column for them to eat, and they take advantage of tiny things like zooplankton as well, because you can get really tiny fish. And then other nectin consist of marine mammals. So whales, of course, porpoises, and then seals and sea lions, and then manatees. Reptiles, there are sea turtles that exist in the world. There are sea snakes as well. And there's only one marine lizard. Does anybody know what that is? Ooh, extra credit if you can name the one marine lizard that is out there. Hopefully we're going to visit it soon here. And then, of course, seabirds as well are vertebrates that you could consider nectin. And what is nectin? Nectin are things that nectin are things that can move against the water current, and we talked about that earlier in the marine biology, the first week, I believe. And so plankton are things that drift along with the current. Nectin are things that can actively swim against the water current. And there's two types of nectin. There's holoepipelagic, which means they spend their whole life up in this epipelagic zone, so up in the upper surface of the water column, and they don't become benthic. They're not bent. They are nectin for life, okay? And then there's, so this consists of sharks, tuna, albacore fish, marlin, swordfish, fast-swimming fish. If you're going to spend your whole life up in the upper water column, exposed, right, you got to be fast, and all of these are fast things. They got to be fast and they're slightly camouflaged, the way that they're bicolored and things like that. But you have to be fast to get away because you're not going to go down and hide in the bottom. Partly because you're out there where it's so deep and you're far out a little ways. Oftentimes where the continental shelf comes up and currents come up right along in here and then kind of cause this upwelling, and you're out in this epipelagic zone, not in the neritic zone, so you're out on the edge. There's nowhere to hide, so you must be fast. Those are holoepipelagic, spend their whole life there. Meroepipelagic are organisms that spend only part of their life cycle in the epipelagic zone. So again, nectonic things that spend part of their life as nectin and then part of their life sort of as benthic. And there's a couple different ways that you could do this, right? So some spend their adult life up in the epipelagic, but then spawn near shore. So herring do this. Herring are out here along the continental shelves and slopes, far out at sea, feeding on plankton and feeding in the upwelling zones. And then they come inshore, near shore. So then they are what we call meroepipelagic for that to spawn. Whale sharks do this, and some dolphin and salmon do this, of course, by the fact that they go up rivers. I have a link here to a video on herring spawning that is super rad, so I encourage you guys to go to the slideshow and click on that link there and check that out. It's a really cool little video on herring spawning up in Alaska. And then some do it on a daily cycle. Some are down in the rocks, hiding and sleeping, and then they swim up or out into the epipelagic zone to feed during part of the day as well. Most meroplankton have a juvenile stage in the epipelagic zone and then become benthic later on in life. Okay. And I have another video linked here as well that you guys can check out. So that is Nectin in a nutshell when we're looking at it. Pretty cool stuff. And next week, we're going to jump into sharks. Okay. So in kind of reviewing this here, we worked our way into the vertebrates and what are the different vertebrate groups. Lampreys and hagfish make up the Agnatha group, the very first and most primitive group. And then in the ocean, the next two big groups are going to be osteichthyes and chondrichthyes. But other groups as well. Everything really except for amphibians. Amphibians don't really exist in the ocean. Interesting. The reptiles, mammals, and birds also have ocean forms, but those backbones and those segmented muscle blocks allow them to be larger in size and free swimming, right? Because they're strong. And so that ability to free swim has allowed them to dominate that epipelagic zone of the ocean and take advantage, feeding off of benthic things, but also moving around and following food and things like that. All right. That's about it. Weekly questions, get those done, and peace out.